Hello friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in this session we are going to talk once again on party and party system in India. We have conducted 2 sessions on the same topic and we have tried to gather maximum knowledge, maximum information on the following topic. Friends, today in this session, first we are going to talk on regional parties and later half we are going to talk on the debates. Friends, for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios the subject expert Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Satish Kumar Jha is Associate Professor in Department of Political Science, Aryabhatta College, University of Delhi. Let's welcome our guest, Dr. Satish Kumar Jha, and let's try to understand more about party and party system in India. Hello sir, welcome to the lecture.
Thank you Geetha ji and good afternoon. In fact, today's lecture is a continuation of what we have been discussing over the last 2 lectures on party and party system in India. Today's lecture is basically third part of that series. In fact, in earlier 2 lectures we have discussed that how political parties have evolved in India and how the patterns, certain patterns could be figured out on basis of their evolution, their functioning and so on and so forth. Now, on basis of the broad patterns which we have seen over the years, I divided the entire party system in India into 6 different phases, and this is what we discussed in our earlier lectures. The first phase was the movement party system, that is after 1920 to the enactment of India's constitution, the first general election, then the Congress system from 1952 to 1969. Then the third was a confrontationist phase in Indian party system, that was basically 69 or 69 onwards to 77, but one can stretch it to 1980. Then you have 1980 to 89, a differentiated party system. The hallmark of that phase was that national and regional parties got differentiated on basis of certain issues. And then 1989 onwards, a very significant phase that has been called by some scholars a beginning of the multi-party system in India, when Congress decline became quite visible, lost power both at the center and the states, and that trend, that new pattern of coalition building minority government, which started in 1989 with BP Singh and continued till 2014 general election. So this was perhaps a longer, one can say, the spell in terms of the certain characteristics which were visible in Indian politics. Now, what happened that 1914 general election, I mentioned, that heralds the 6th phase, that is the current phase, which is going on. In fact, I also mentioned in my earlier lecture that it is too early to pass any judgment on this, because jury is still out whether this is going to last long or it is going as temporary phase in Indian politics, because this era of coalition politics ended in 2014 general election, when BJP led by Narendra Modi formed the government on its own, though of course it is NDA government, but nonetheless one should remember the BJP had the majority in the parliament, in Lok Sabha. So therefore this is the 6th phase which is going on. The 6th phase I mentioned that has certain features. For example, in the Congress system phase, or even subsequently, as I discussed in my earlier lectures, that Congress was basically the center of gravitation. Now, in this 6th phase, what we find that BJP has become the center of gravitation. So, anti-BJPism, as earlier it was anti-Congressism, has become the defining feature of Indian politics in last decade or so. So therefore, this is a new kind of beginning in Indian politics. On the one hand, the coalition era seems to have ended, and on the other hand, you have certain new patterns which are also visible. For example, after 2014 election, there was a debate whether identity politics has come to an end in Indian politics, because many parties, regional parties particularly, who were basically functioning on basis of certain identities, caste, ethnicity, and so on and so forth, those parties suffered a setback. They lost percentage of votes, they lost seats, and therefore a debate started around that time, 2014, that whether the era of identity politics in India has come to an end. But then after 2014 general election, we have had many state elections, and in those elections again regional parties bounced back like Bihar and some other states, and therefore this debate is yet to be settled, because identity politics, one doesn't know that whether it has come to an end or 2014 was just an aberration. Though of course there are scholars who argue that even the BJP's ascendancy to power has been based on certain type of identity politics. If it is not caste, then it is religion and community. So therefore this issue we have already touched in earlier lectures. Now in today's lecture, in fact we have to look at the regional parties, and this is a very important category in Indian politics, the regional parties, because what has happened, the regional parties are not new in terms of their formation. They have been there for last 6-7 decades or more, one can say. Even in colonial period, there were many groups in society who didn't agree with the Congress agenda, and therefore they had their separate organizations. Some of the Dravidian parties, Scheduled Caste Federation. In fact, one can say that in Jammu and Kashmir you had National Conference. So therefore, in fact, the regional parties are not new to Indian politics. But what has happened, that this importance of regional parties has grown many-fold over the years, and therefore this is very important. And this is what I was referring to in my earlier lectures, as well as I also mentioned in the beginning of my lecture today, that 1989, post-1989 period is very significant in Indian politics. On the one hand, this also signaled the end of one party dominant system. That is how the scholars like Maurice Jones and Rajani Kothari, through his Congress system, looked at Indian politics, the predominance of Congress. What were the reasons for that predominance, we have discussed in our earlier lecture. Now what has happened, that 89 on the one hand signaled the end of this, on the other hand heralded a new era, that was the coalition era and the minority government in Indian politics. The first minority government in India was formed 1989, led by VP Singh, who revolted and rebelled within the Congress and formed his Jana Morcha, and then a government which was supported from both sides, by left and the right. This was a unique experiment in Indian politics. On the one hand, the CPM, CPI in the left front supporting it from outside, on the other hand the BJP supporting on another side. So therefore this was a minority government against the Congress party. Now what happened, that this minority government phenomenon continued, and then immediately after that we have had another government led by Chandrasekhar. Then 1991 we have had this Congress government led by Narasimha Rao, again fell short of majority mark, and therefore it was again a minority government. Of course the opposition parties were not in a mood to go to elections, therefore they decided that they would be not toppling the government or basically bringing it down. So therefore this minority government continued. Of course before the next election, that is 1996, there were other controversies when this government Narasimha Rao tried to muster majority by certain defections, including Jharkhand Mukti Morcha, and that became very infamous. That is JMM case, when the charges of bribery and other things were leveled. So that is basically 91. The 1996 again a coalition government. The 98 again another coalition government led by NDA for the first time under Atal Bihari Vajpayee. Then 1999 again coalition government by the same NDA led by Vajpayee, and then 2004 and 2009 the two governments led by UPA 1 and UPA 2, that United the Progressive Alliance. So therefore this was the era of coalition politics in India, and in all these coalitions we should remember that regional parties played a very important role. Now of course this new, apart from this, that the regional parties became very prominent in Indian politics, so much so that many scholars have pointed out that post 1989 one can also read it as federalization of Indian polity, as there is a lot of debate on Indian federalism, that how Indian constitution has been called a quasi-federal constitution, that of course with a lot of unitary biases. But then the argument is that without making major changes in the constitutional design, the entire Indian polity got federalized, and that federalization happened through the agency of political parties, because the way regional parties started playing important role in national politics, some of the regional concerns occupied center stage, and therefore the kind of dominance with the center earlier was exercising on the provincial government, the state government, that didn't happen, and therefore it was the federalization or regionalization of Indian polity. This is also a debate among scholars. But apart from this, there are other features of this period which cannot be ignored so far as party and party system is concerned. For example, earlier Indian parties were divided into two. Normally they were seen through the prism of left-right categorization, left of the center and right of the center. Now, left of the center, of course, there were parties on the left of the center, and then there were factions within the Congress who were also considered left of the center. Then there was the right of the center, that there were certain parties which were right of the center. For example, Swatantra Party or earlier, Bharatiya Janasangh, they were considered right of the center parties. But now what happened that post 91, and this is the period when 89 I was mentioning the new phase started. Post 91 economic reforms, what happened that completely blurred this distinction left right, because the kind of consensus emerged on economic reforms and new economic policy, except perhaps the left political parties. Most of the political parties agreed more or less with minor modifications. We will be coming to this issue later. But another important factor which blurred this left-right distinction was this coalition making, because what happened that the kind of important role the regional parties started playing, they completely blurred this distinction, because regional parties, as we should remember that they do not have that type of ideological glue or ideological commitment. Nonetheless, some of them avoid at least in public rhetoric, they basically talk about ideology, but nonetheless their concerns are purely local, regional, and even sometimes the concerns are also narrow identity based concerns, be it language, caste, community, ethnicity, and so on and so forth. So therefore, this coalition building exercise, coalition making exercise in post 1989 period in Indian politics also and basically the role which was played by the regional parties blurred this distinction. So therefore, what happened that on one hand economic reforms and the broad consensus, on the other hand this new role which regional parties played in Indian politics completely blurred this distinction. And then this period should also be remembered for initiation of a new type of politics which is called identity politics. Of course, we should remember that identity politics was not new to India even then in 1989. In fact, earlier also we have had identity based political formation. In fact, we should be aware about a lot of scholarly writings and studies which have been done on the role of caste in Indian politics, including Rajani Kothari's famous book Caste in Indian Politics, Rudolph and many other political scientists who have worked on this issue, that how caste was politicized and how in absence of pressure groups like some of the democracies like United States of America, caste associations played the important role in India. I mean, they played the role of pressure group in mobilizing the people and inducting them into the electoral process. So therefore, such studies are available which have demonstrated the salience of caste politics, caste in Indian politics. But what happened at this period, that is 90s, coincided with many things. Some of the things were basically global, that is globalization, end of Cold War, a new type of global politics, and then of course a new era which was called the era of globalization, a formation of World Trade Organization, etc. etc. But in Indian context, this also got coincided with economic reforms after this balance of payment crisis of 1991. But along with these economic changes or changes in economic sphere, we have had certain cultural social developments, or one can say the certain changes in cultural and social in a sphere. And here one can simply mention two important factors which played very important role in Indian politics in this period. On the one hand, we have had the implementation of Mandal Commission report in 1990, which basically gave a new type of orientation to the entire OBC politics, other backward class politics in India, particularly in northern states. And because earlier this OBC politics, other backward class politics, always converged with the politics of rich peasants and the kulak politics. That is perhaps what happened in UP, western UP, certain parts of Punjab, Haryana, etc., when we have had Bharatiya Kranti Dal and other political parties. But now this new phase in this politics witness altogether new phase and new issues, and this is what normally is referred as a Mandalization of Indian politics, when there were certain caste groups which got mobilized and then they found their expression or their articulation or representation through certain political groups, and some of these groups were initially the Janata Dal affiliated groups, but later on they splintered and became regional outfits like Samajwadi Party, Rashtriya Janata Dal United, and so on and so forth. So therefore this one dimension was this Mandal politics. Another was this Ayodhya movement, the Ram Janmabhoomi movement, which basically catapulted BJP to prominence in 90s, and subsequently we find that there was no looking back, and it went on to form the first NDA government in 1998, and subsequently again we can see that 1999 general election it won, and finally it cemented its place in Indian politics as a very important political formation, and so much so that 2014, as I was referring, that it won the majority seats at its own, though decided to form the NDA government. But another important feature of this period, that is 90s, and which has been continuing even today, is basically this competitive populism in Indian among Indian political parties. Now this competitive populism, when I talk of, I basically refer to two types of populism, the left-wing populism and the right-wing populism. Now of course, populism is also not new to Indian politics. Political parties were quite conversant with doing populist politics. Many scholars have argued that the populism was also there during the colonial period against the British rule, when Indian National Congress was basically mobilizing the people. Even some of the aspects of Gandhian politics are also seen through the prism of populism. But what happened, that the most important period from the point of view of populism in Indian politics is remembered or associated with 1971, particularly Mrs. Indira Gandhi's call for Garibi Hatao, bank nationalization, end of previous purses, and this is referred as the left-wing populism, pro-poor rhetoric, and therefore this was the beginning of a new era in Indian politics and in the conduct and the functioning of political parties in India. But now what happened, that it was not only left-wing populism, but simultaneously we find the right-wing populism also growing in prominence. And if left-wing populism is associated with pro-poor rhetoric, particularly reference to poverty eradication, upliftment of downtrodden, and so on and so forth, the right-wing populism is associated with nationalism, national integration, and so many other things. So what has happened, that today we find that both types of populism are vying with each other. And therefore, some of the parties which basically take recourse to both types of populism at the same time. For example, the BJP, on the one hand, we can see that on nationalism, it basically takes the high, pitch of the right-wing populism. But on the other hand, it doesn't abandon this complete, space of left-wing populism to the opposition parties. For example, it also talks about Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. The entire demonetization exercise was at least, presented as a move against the rich, and it was pro-poor. The government is often portrayed by political party as a pro-poor. So therefore, tries to combine both types of populism, and this is something very special in this period of of Indian politics, so far as the functioning of political parties is concerned. So is the Congress. For example, when the UPA-1 was formed in 2004, many of us can recall that National Advisory Council was formed under the leadership, on the chairmanship of Mrs. Sonia Gandhi, who was the president of the Congress. Now, National Advisory Council had representations from different walks of life, including many social movements in India. And therefore, National Advisory Council used to prepare the policy draft for the government. Now, many policy initiatives of this period of the government, that is UPA 1, like Manrega, Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, the Forest Dwellers Act, the Food Security Act, all these acts were basically drafted at the behest of this National Advisory Council. So, therefore, what it tried to do, tried to basically portray the government as pro-poor or pro-development or pro-underprivileged. So much so that one of the scholars on Indian politics, James Menor, has observed that this period, this UPA 1, was truly a period of social democracy in India. Of course, marred later by the corruption charges and other things, but nonetheless, according to James Menor, this was truly a social democratic phase of Indian politics. Not the Nehruvian phase, not the Indira Gandhi's phase after 69, but UPA 1, because of this pro-poor or pro-disprivileged and underprivileged policy initiatives through National Advisory Council and so on and so forth. So, therefore, this is one thing. On nationalism, of course, nationalism has traditionally been the plank of the Congress party, but in recent years we have seen that BJP seems to have basically edged it out. In fact, one of the important leader of the party once said that the Congress has vacated that space, and therefore that space has been occupied by the BJP. Of course, one thing we should remember, that nationalism, of course, has many articulations and varying interpretations in Indian context, not only Indian context, world over, but in India also this contestation is on the interpretation of nationalism. The BJP and the Congress both talk of nationalism, but their interpretation of nationalism is different. But nonetheless, what we find today, the kind of nationalism which is catching the imagination of the people, that nationalism is basically presented as the exclusive agenda of a political party, and therefore one can say that this right-wing populism and the left-wing populism both are basically moving together. Of course, political parties are trying to harmonize and combine the two, which is at times not easy, and therefore sometimes we find also a lot of tensions in it. So, therefore, in fact, this is what we have to keep in mind if we look at the larger patterns of political parties in the way in terms of their conduct and functioning in India. Now, of course, 2014 election, I mentioned that the debate is going on, that whether it is end of coalition era, whether it is end of identity politics, or is just a temporary phase, and it is not a long-lasting phase. It is not going to be the long-lasting phase. But jury is still out. Jury is out on this, and only the next election, or one can say that one or two more general elections, would be able to shed light on this, that whether it was a temporary phase or it would be a long-lasting phase. Now, in light of all these issues, before I move to regional parties, one thing is important to remember: the issue of ideology. Because normally, the regional parties are also differentiated from national parties in terms of ideological orientation. It is argued that regional parties do not have ideological orientation, whereas national parties have ideological orientation. All national parties. Of course, there are two ways to look at national parties. One is in terms of the Election Commission's classification, which I mentioned in my earlier lecture, in percentage of votes, number of seats. The 6% votes share in 4 and more states, then number of seats they win in the election, and other criteria. And those who basically fall short of it, they are categorized as state parties. If you have less than 6% votes, or you have only the members in the assembly, and other similar criteria which have been laid down by the Election Commission, which I mentioned in my last lecture. But there is another way to look at national and regional in terms of orientation, that how regional parties and national parties have different orientations. The national parties are oriented towards national issues, the issues which are not exclusively about certain regions, certain sections, but it is multi-class, multi-caste, multi-region, multilingual agenda. So to say that basically the entire agenda is geared towards national interest, not only regional interest but national interest. So in terms of orientation, and then the regional parties, if they are compared with this type of orientation, it is argued the regional parties are essentially geared towards sectional interests, certain regional interests, be it linguistic, be it community, or be it caste or ethnic interest, but nonetheless they are geared towards certain sectional interests. But one thing is important, that in among Indian political parties, this to some extent is true, that regional and national can be differentiated on basis of ideology. For example, in terms of orientation, if you don't go by strictly by election commission's criteria, because then we find that after every election there are certain parties who are declassified as national parties, and there are certain parties which are classified as national parties, because if they fulfill those criteria, percentage of votes and the seats, etc. But if we go by orientation, then we find that there are parties which are normally considered national, irrespective of their electoral performance. And for example, Congress party, Bharatiya Janata party, the left parties, they are considered to be the national parties who have their presence in more than one states, rather quite number of states. And on the other hand, the issues they are concerned with are not regional, sectional or particular. They basically talk about the larger issues which are before the nation. So therefore, this is how the national and regional can be also differentiated. But when we talk of ideology, we should remember, and in the last lecture I had also alluded to this fact, that normally it is argued that Indian political parties, be it national or regional, the ideology does not play much important role. But the fact of the matter is that at one level we can see that ideology is a very important factor, or at least appears to be a factor, as a glue which basically unites or at least holds certain parties together. And that ideological glue can be seen if we discuss political parties not individually or separately, but at the level of the larger conglomerates, or one can say the family. That how political parties are basically divided in India in terms of families. When I talk of family, not in terms of dynastic family, but in ideological families. And therefore, here one can say that this family division of Indian political parties is very important, and this is what one can call it a parivar ideology. At this level, like-minded parties coming together, not coming together, but at times functioning separately, but when the need arises, they can come together. But one thing we should remember, that in coalition era, in spite of this parivar ideology, we can find that parties who have basically splintered from a parent organization, but nonetheless when it comes to the party government formation, they can form government with a party which belongs to certain other ideological family. For example, one can give the example of TMC Bengal forming a government with NDA in 1998, and similar such instances can be repeated. So therefore, this is one thing which we should remember, that ideology operates in among Indian political parties at the level of this parivar ideology, not as a parivar, not in terms of family or dynasty, but in terms of ideology. Here in fact we can identify certain ideological families, and in last lecture I had also alluded it, that is the Congress family, and you have number of splinter groups, the parties which have basically come out of Congress. For example, Jan Congress, Bangla Congress, Kerala Congress, Loktantrik Congress, then Congress for Democracy in 77, then Congress Ars Swaran, Nationalist Congress Party, the Jan Morcha, VP Singh, the Tamil Manila Congress, TMC, and so many other political parties which have been formed after a split, or moving out of the Congress, leaders moving out of the Congress. Similarly, you have another family, ideological family, that is called Sangh Parivar. And here you have the BJP, earlier it was the Bharatiya Janata Sangh, then RSS, then VHP, then Bajrang Dal, then you have the Shiv Sena, which also broadly is part of this Sangh Parivar family. The third is the Janta Parivar. Janta Party, which was formed after JP movement, ideologically one can say that they are also quite close to the Lohiite brand of socialism, but nonetheless they were the product of the JP movement, and this Janta Parivar also has many political parties. Earlier it was Janta Dal, then it got a split, and then now you have many regional outfits carrying the prefix of Janta. You have Biju Janta Dal, you have Janta Dal Secular, you have Samajwadi Party, you have Rashtriya Janta Dal, you have JDU, and such political parties one can put as this Janta Parivar family. And here the caste, the regional identity, the personality cult or the personality of a leader, these factors have played important role, that nonetheless they swear by the ideology of socialism. So therefore these are the political parties along with the left ideology and the left family and the Dalit ideology and the Dalit family. So this is how these regional parties, one can say, that can also be seen through the prism of this family ideology, that is Parivar ideology.
Well, this note, thank you so very much for giving us this session on party and party system in India. Dear friends, you are requested to be with us as we are back after a short break. Thank you. Hello friends, welcome back to this session. Friends, as you know that we are talking on party and party system in India. Friends, for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Satish Kumar Jha is Associate Professor in Department of Political Science, Aryabhatta College, University of Delhi. Now, I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Jha, once again and would request him to continue further.
Thank you. In fact, in the earlier part of our discussion, we are discussing that how ideology matters, in Indian politics and for Indian political parties at different level, because normally it is believed that all political parties are bereft of ideology. They do not, swear by any ideology, and that period when there were parties, ideologically oriented political parties, that has completely disappeared today. Even there is a lot of argument which is available, which argues that the class politics has completely flattened, and the left, the way the left political outfits and the political formations have declined. That also shows that how this ideological aspect of Indian politics is basically fast vanishing. But one thing we should remember, as I was mentioning, that at a different level we have the prominence or the salience of ideology, and this is what I put at the level of this parivar ideology. The political parties also have an ideological parivar or ideological family, and therefore, in spite of the temporary separation, to the extent that some political parties, even if they belong to this ideological family, even then they don't mind forming government with a party of altogether another family. And I gave the example of how the TMC Bengal formed government with Trinamool Congress, how it formed government with NDA, which was basically a party of a different ideological family. So therefore, the 3, 4, 5 such ideological families I identified: the Congress family, the Sangh Parivar, the Janata Parivar. The fourth is, of course, the left party, the left Parivar. And here, in fact, this ideological glue is the idea, ideology of Marxism and Leninism. And after 1958, when the left parties decided to join parliamentary politics, after that it had many split. The CPI became CPI and CPM, then you had CPI M and CPI ML, and then CPI ML has many outfits, and some of the outfits, of course, believe in parliamentary politics. But one can find here an ideological glue here as a family. And sometimes, for example, in Bengal, when it ruled for a long period of time, it was a left front government. So is Kerala. So was the Tripura before its recent defeat. So therefore, this another family is the left ideology based family. The next is the Dalit parties, and one can also put them as a family. The ideological glue here is, of course, the ideas and ideologies of Phule, Ambedkar, Periyar, and here one can say the most important political formation is the Bahujan Samaj Party, which has ruled the UP for many years, which always has a good presence in the parliament. Then you have a Republican Party in Maharashtra, then Dalit Panther, but of course Dalit Panther does not join electoral politics. Then you have this another political party led by Ram Vilas Paswan. So therefore, one can see this Dalit family and political parties with this ideology, and one can put it as a Dalit ideology, Dalit Parivar in terms of political parties and their functioning. Now, so this is at one level. But the one issue which I initiated was the ideology issue, that how ideological distinctions are blurred. The national and regional categorization is to some extent valid, but national not in terms of ideology but in terms of orientation, that they only take up national issues, and the regional issues are also taken up, but only from the point of view of national policy agenda. The regional parties are more geared towards regional and local issues. The class politics, as I mentioned, that had completely got flattened. Today the trade union movement, the farmers and peasant based political parties, they are in decline. But then the other ideological issues which can be considered important for national political parties today, and that is nationalism, and the market versus state issue, the secularism, and the caste class distinction, and so on and so forth. For example, nationalism, the national parties, like one can say, if one calls Congress, BJP and the left parties as national parties in terms of their orientation, then on nationalism we find that they are divided. All parties will talk about nationalism, but someone, one will talk about cultural nationalism, that is BJP, but the Congress and left may be comfortable with syncretic nationalism. Market and state, the left parties are totally opposed to market, whereas the Congress and BJP have different take on market-state relationship. Of course, Congress was the architect of economic reforms, but nonetheless, when it comes to minimal state or maximum intervention of a state, they get divided, or the question of a state as an enabler or as a regulator. Similarly, on secularism, the BJP talks about secularism and says that it doesn't believe in minority appeasement. On the other hand, critiques or attacks Congress for practicing minority appeasement, while the Congress talks about minority protection or Sarva Dharma Sambhav, equal respect, and within equal respect, at least a special protection to certain vulnerable sections like minorities as per the constitutional provisions. So therefore, these are some of the issues we find that national parties are divided among themselves. When it comes to regional parties, these issues are there, but the regional parties, of course, are more concerned about certain other set of issues, and they are mostly regional. Now, coming to this question of regional parties, national and regional, and national we have already seen that how national parties could be analyzed and could be interpreted. Coming to regional parties, on the one hand you have the election commission criteria, on the other hand in terms of orientation I have already mentioned that those parties which are regional in orientation. Now what we find that if we look at the regional parties in India, they are not new to Indian politics. It is not that only in 1989 when regionalization of Indian politics started, as it is argued, the regional parties basically appeared on the political horizon. In fact, regional parties have been here for quite some time. Even in colonial period, as I mentioned, that some regional parties were born. For example, the Dravidian parties. So therefore, if we look at the regional parties and their spread, then we find that there are three zones, broad geographical zones, in which we can find the regional parties are spread in India. One zone is basically the oldest and perhaps the most powerful zone. One can say that it is perhaps the zone where you had a very strident, or one can say extreme regionalism, which was visible. And this is deep south, northeastern states and northwestern states of India. In fact, they are the oldest in terms of their origin. Jammu Kashmir, Punjab, northeastern states and South India. So particularly Tamil Nadu. So therefore, this is one geographical zone. The second zone is the intermediate zone, or one can zone of intermediate regionalism, not extreme regionalism, the way the first zone represented or suggested. This intermediate regionalism zone, where one can put Bengal, Andhra Pradesh, Maharashtra and Assam. And then the third zone is basically the moderate regionalism zone. And in moderate regionalism zone, you have the states like Gujarat, you have Odisha, Maharashtra and Karnataka. Here, in fact, most of these states are Hindi speaking zone. And therefore, one can say that another important feature of this moderate regionalism zone is that the parties are more nationalistic than regional. They are as nationalistic in orientation than perhaps as the other national parties. But the only difference is that their social base is located in certain regions, and therefore they all operate in those regions, and they are seen as regional parties. For example, in recent times, of course, the parties which have emerged, they have emerged in intermediate regionalism zone. For example, Assam Gram Parishad, PDP or TDP, they come from the intermediate zone, not from the moderate regionalism zone. So what we find that this way, we can see that the regional parties are spread in three different zones, and there are differences among them in terms of their regional orientation. You have the first zone, which is highly, one can say that extreme regionalism they have practiced, and they are in deep south, northeast, northwest. Then you have intermediate regionalism, and then the moderate regionalism. Now, of course, regional parties could also be classified on basis of another criteria, that is long standing and the short standing. There are regional parties which have long standing in Indian politics. Here one can say the Akali Dal. You have the Dravidian parties. you have the National Conference in Jammu and Kashmir, you have the Mizo National Front, and many such parties are long-standing regional parties, and they basically were born on issue of federal concerns or federal issues. Some of them even became separatist in terms of their ideology and in terms of their functioning. But gradually, of course, they were tamed through constitutional politics, and now of course they remain committed to this regional autonomy, but nonetheless many of them have abandoned their separatist agenda. But one thing is very clear, that they have a long standing presence in Indian politics. On the other hand, there are other regional parties which are short standing. In fact, they have emerged in last 2-3 decades, and therefore most of them have emerged in this moderate regionalism zone. In fact, their orientation is also very close to the orientation of nationalist political parties, or one can say national political parties, not regional political parties, in terms of issues, in terms of their social base, in terms of their commitment. The only difference is that these short standing regional parties gradually have started locating their base in the sectional interest of the society, be it caste, community or ethnicity. Here in this short standing regional parties, one can put the Janta Parivar political parties, be it Samajwadi Party, Rashtriya Janata Dal United, Biju Janata Dal, and so on and so forth. Then of course there are certain other parties which have gone out of the Congress Parivar, Congress family, like Trinamool Congress and similar other outfits, or some other political parties which have gone out of the Sangh Parivar, like Shiv Sena. So they are the short standing, 2-3 decades. In fact, on many issues their orientation is centrist, but as I mentioned, that on caste, class and local issues their orientation become regional. In fact, some of these short standing regional parties are more concerned with fiscal federalism, devolution of more resources to states, and this has started in 80s, which I mentioned earlier, when Telugu Desam Party, Janata Party in Karnataka under Hegde and many other political parties have started this initiative, and the Sarkaria Commission was formed. Now later on, the Biju Patnaik in Odisha took up this issue very vigorously. He basically raised the issue of freight equalization as a mechanism through which certain states were deprived of their due in terms of the national resources, and therefore they have been raising this issue of fiscal federalism and financial devolution. So therefore this is the short standing regional parties. But one thing is also important to remember, that the short standing regional parties have two other features which are not generally seen in the long standing political parties. Though of course now some of the regional political parties who have a long standing have also been suffering from this virus. One is the personality cult, another is the dynastic rule. In fact, in the short standing regional parties, mostly coming from the Janata Parivar, we find this personality cult becoming very important. The parties basically are formed and they survive around a particular around the personality of a leader. And then there are dynastic tendencies. Earlier it was believed that the Congress has basically created this dynastic politics in India, but now we find that this is spreading to different political parties, both national level and the regional level, mostly at the regional level. So therefore this personality and dynasty, two important factors can be seen in the short standing regional political parties. But one can say that this personality and dynasty are also now can be seen in the long standing regional political parties like Akali Dal and DMK in Madras, or National Conference in Jammu and Kashmir. The same dynastic features are seen there, that a leader succeeded by his or her son. So therefore this personality and dynastic more of course visible in the short standing regional parties, but can equally be seen in the long standing regional political parties. Then of course, then another way to classify regional parties is that those parties which have been separatist and those parties which have been federalist, because of course all of them initially were born against on the basis of their criticism of the dominance of the Congress and the center, or one can say that against the constitutional design which was tilted in direction or in favor of the center. But nonetheless, within broad this categorization, we find that some of them turned separatist, and here most of them were the parties or the states in the northeastern states, Mizoram, Nagaland, then of course Dravid Munitkargam, the DMK in particularly 60s in Tamil Nadu, National Conference in Jammu and Kashmir till Sheikh Abdullah was alive, of course before his accord with Mrs. Indira Gandhi. So therefore, the old National Conference in Jammu and Kashmir, then the Akali Dal in Punjab till 80s, when they were basically spearheading a separatist movement and talking about Anandpur Sahib resolution and so on and so forth. But later on, many of them have abandoned this separatist agenda, separatist politics, and have become federalists. They believe in regional autonomy, they believe in devolution of power, they believe in more financial resources, and so on and so forth. So therefore, like Telugu Desam Party, Biju Janata Dal, and many other political parties can be put in this category. Or one can say that all regional parties, when they talk of a special package for their states, like JDU in Bihar, or a special status for their states, one can say that they are more federalists, they are federalist in orientation, and they cannot be called separatists from any point of view. So the separatist federalist distinction is also a distinction which at times become important to understand the regional parties in India. Of course, so far the issues before the regional parties are concerned, unlike national political parties, the issues are different. If issues before national political parties in India are nationalism, market versus state issue, secularism, the caste class distinctions, and similar other issues, even one can say the foreign policy issues, the regional parties have issues like language, have issues like backwardness of that state, the issues like caste, issues like religion, issues like community identity, and therefore on these issues the regional parties basically find their base on basis of they try to create their constituency. On basis of these issues they try to mobilize the people. For example, DMK from the very beginning has been raising the issue of language, the English Hindi issue, imposition of Hindi. Then on the basis of caste, one can say that RJD, Samajwadi Party and other political parties mobilize their constituency or create their constituency. On religion, one can say that Akali Dal's main plank from the very beginning has been religion. Similarly, the backwardness. Some of the states, or community, in fact, Shiv Sena often talks about this ethnic origin of the people, or one can say the community identity. The backwardness, there are certain political parties who talk about the backwardness of their states and the regions, like Biju Janata Dal talks about the backwardness of Odisha, or Janata Dal United talks about the backwardness of Bihar. So therefore, these are the issues on basis of which one can also see that how regional parties are divided, and there are different issues on basis of which different regional parties have emerged, they survive, they mobilize, and they try to basically create their constituency. Of course, one thing is very clear here, that this left of the center, right of the center distinction has completely got blurred due to the participation of regional parties in the formation of government at the center in coalition era, which I also mentioned earlier. So therefore, this is something you should remember about regional political parties. Now there are 2-3 issues. One thing is that there are parties which can also be considered the parties which have which are born through movements, and one can call them movement parties. Here one can give the example of Bahujan Samaj Party. Here one can give the example of Republican Party to some extent, and more recently one can give the example of Aam Aadmi Party. So they are the movement based political parties. They started as a movement and then got transformed into political parties. And then there is another issue which we should remember, that this entire political parties, be it national or regional, one can say that a kind of degeneration has set in among these political parties, and this is a matter of debate among scholars, that why there is a decline of political parties, why political parties are not being able to inspire confidence among the people so far as the representation is concerned, why people gradually are feeling that their interests are not best represented by these political parties, and therefore sometimes they repose their faith in movements, social movements, be it old social movements or new social movements. They in fact articulate their concerns and their issues through movements, not through political parties. So therefore, what is the reason for this decline? And therefore, scholars have been debating this issue. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, that political parties' decline is not confined to India. World over, at global level, one can find this trend that political parties are in a state of terminal decline. But in India, this issue is becoming equally visible and equally prominent. Now, so far as this decline of political parties is concerned, there are a lot of parties, one can say that which are suffering from similar set of problems. It is not confined to one political party. Most of the political parties are afflicted by these issues, and therefore we have to identify and we have to discuss that what are the issues which are confronting these political parties, and unless these issues are addressed, unless they reform themselves, unless there is a concerted attempt for the reform of these political parties are not going to to inspire confidence among the people, among the electorates and among the citizens. Now, there are 5-6 different set of issues. One is the question of internal democracy. The second is the question of funding. Third is basically the question of the division of political parties between organizational wing and the legislative wing. Then, of course, there is a question of expansion of or the renewal of social base, and then of course the question of the training of their followers and their workers, along with the question of defection and so on and so forth. So now what we find that there are different issues before the political parties, and they have to be addressed. Now this internal democracy is a very important issue, and this issue is as old as Mitchell's iron law of oligarchy, when he talked about that every political party has an iron law of oligarchy, and the same set of people keep circulating, the leaders keep circulating, and there is no movement from the bottom. Now what has happened, that this lack of internal democracy has also promoted a dynastic rule. In fact, recently Kanchan Chandra has written a book, Democratic Dynasty in India. Now of course, why this lack of internal democracy has created a situation where there is no outlet, or there is no channel through which the representation of many sections or the groups which are basically affiliated to a political party can take place. And when they find that there is no representational opportunity or avenues for them, they look for alternative sites. And this is how Jaffrelot in his book Silent Revolution has analyzed the cracks in the Congress's social base in North and South, that why it got cracked in North and why it remains intact in South. South, there was opening for different sections of society to come to the leadership strata, but in North it was completely choked, and therefore those sections started looking for alternative avenues, and therefore the Congress base collapsed in the north. So therefore, this is important internal democracy. Parties do not have regular elections in spite of election commission's mandate. They simply do these elections on the paper, but they don't have a very well organized election. Similar question is the question of funding, that many political parties do not have resources, and therefore, in fact, in 1969, when the corporate funding in India was banned, many regional parties or the national parties were completely, their channel for resources got dried. So therefore, there are many issues of funding also. Recently, of course, there is a election bond issue which has come up, the government has proposed, but there are many proposals. There have been many attempts by election commission, law commission, the Venkat Chalaya commission which was formed in 1999, they also came up with certain proposals. So these issues have to be seen, that what are the proposals for reforms and what are the issues which are basically plaguing the political parties in India. I will stop here.
With this note, thank you so very much. Dear friends, if you wish to give your feedback for this lecture, then do write to us at info.cec@nic.in. Your feedbacks as well as your questions are welcome. We are going to meet again soon and would be discussing more. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you once again.